Hello, this is Mike History 2, and today I will be talking about the Falklands War, and this time I'll actually be talking about the war. So if you want to know what led up to the war, watch my last video. It's a video just about the lead up to the Falklands War, so watch that to get some context. And once you're done that, then we can continue. Alright, so the first encounters of the war began in April, with the British task force being shadowed by Boeing 707 aircraft of the Argentine Air Force during their travel to the south. Several of these flights were intercepted by Sea Harriers outside the British-imposed total exclusion zones, and the unarmed 707s were not attacked because diplomatic moves were still in progress and the United Kingdom had not yet decided to commit itself to war. The South Georgia Force, Operation Paraquet, under the command of Major Guy Sheridan, RM, consisted of Marines from 42 Commando, a troop of the Special Air Service and Special Boat Service troops who were intended to land as reconnaissance forces for an invasion by the Royal Marines. All were embarked on the RFA Tidespring. Now, the first to arrive was the Churchill-class submarine HMS Conqueror on the 19th of April, and the island was overflown by radar mapping Handley Page Victor on the 20th of April. The first landings of SAS troops began on the 21st of April, but with the southern hemisphere autumn setting in, the weather was so bad that their landings and others made the next day were all withdrawn after two helicopters crashed in fog on Fortuna Glacier. On the 23rd of April, a submarine alert was sounded and operations were halted, with the Tidespring begin to withdraw into deeper water to avoid interception. And on the 24th of April, the British forces regrouped and headed in to finally attack. So on the 25th of April, after resupplying the Argentine garrison in South Georgia, the submarine ARA Santa Fe was spotted on the surface by Westland Wessex HAS Mk3 helicopter from HMS Antrim, which attacked the Argentine submarine with depth charges. The HMS Plymouth launched a Westland Wasp HAS Mk1 helicopter. Why these things always have such complicated names? And HMS Brilliant launched a Westland Lynx HAS Mk2. The Lynx launched a torpedo and strafed the submarine with a general-purpose machine gun, and the Wessex also fired on Santa Fe with its GPMG. The Wasp from HMS Plymouth, as well as two other Wasps launched from HMS Endurance, fired AS-12 ASM anti-ship missiles at the submarine, scoring hits. The Santa Fe was damaged badly enough to prevent her from diving, and the crew abandoned the submarine at the jetty at King Edward Point on South Georgia. Now, with Tidespring now far out to sea, the Argentine forces increased by the submarine's crew. Major Sheridan decided to gather the 76 men he had and make a direct assault that day. After a short forced march by the British troops and a naval bombardment demonstration by two Royal Navy vessels, the Argentine forces surrendered without resistance. The message sent from the naval force of South Georgia to London was, "Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen." The Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, broke the news to the media, telling them to just rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines. And so now, with South Georgia retaken, it was time to take the actual Falklands. So on the 1st of May, British operations on the Falklands began with a Black Buck 1 attack on the airfield at Stanley. A Vulcan bomber from Ascension flew an 8,000 nautical mile round trip, dropping bombs across the runway at Stanley. It required repeated refueling using several Victor K-2 tanker aircraft, which were operating at the same time. Now, the overall effects of these raids on the war is difficult to determine. The runway wasn't actually that damaged, but the psychological effects were greater, and the Argentine intelligence was unable to determine how the British managed to conduct such an attack. As a result, the Argentines determined that their fighter aircraft were vulnerable in Port Stanley, and they were withdrawn to air bases on the Argentine coast, and this severely limited the Argentine Air Force since now all their fighters were actually back in Argentina and not on the Falkland Islands. So this meant that Argentina was only able to launch its combat sorties from the mainland. The majority of the fuel was spent in travel to and from the Falklands, severely limiting their time while pursuing ground targets. In addition, Argentine pilots were also not in a position to engage in extended dogfights with British Harrier jets because they didn't have enough fuel. Now, the Falklands only had 3 airfields. The longest and only paved runway was at the capital, Stanley, and even that was too short to support fast jets. Therefore, the Argentines were forced to launch their major strikes from the mainland. The first major Argentine strike force was made up of 36 aircraft and was sent on the 1st of May in the belief that the British invasion was imminent or landings had already taken place. Only a section of Grupo 6 found ships which were firing at Argentine defenses near the islands. The daggers managed to attack the ships and then returned safely, and this greatly boosted the morale of the Argentine pilots, who now knew that they could survive an attack against modern warships protected by radar ground clutter from the islands and by using the late pop-up profile. Meanwhile, other Argentine aircraft were intercepted by BAE Sea Harriers operating from HMS Invincible. So, fighting broke out between Sea Harrier FRS Mk1 fighters of the 801 Naval Air Squadron and Mirage 3 fighters of Grupo 8. Now, both sides refused to fight at the other's best altitude until 2 Mirages finally descended to engage. One was shot down by AIM 9L Sidewinder air-to-air missile, while the other escaped but was damaged and without enough fuel to return to the mainland. The plane instead decided to go to Stanley, but it was actually shot by Argentine defenders who thought it was British. So Stanley was used as an Argentine strongpoint throughout the conflict. And despite the Black Buck and Harrier raids on Stanley Airfield and shelling by British ships, it was never out of action entirely. So, 2 British naval task forces came, and the Argentine fleet also came, and these were operating in the neighborhood of the Falklands and soon began fighting each other. Now, the first naval loss was the Second World War vintage Argentine light cruiser ARA General Belgrano. The nuclear-powered submarine HMS Conqueror sank General Belgrano on the 2nd of May. 323 members of General Belgrano's crew died in the incident, and more than 700 men were rescued from the ocean despite cold seas and stormy weather. Now, the losses from General Belgrano total nearly half of the Argentine deaths in the Falklands conflict, and the loss of the ship hardened the stance of the Argentine government. Now, regardless of controversies over the sinking, including disagreement about the exact nature of the maritime exclusion zone and whether General Belgrano had been returning to port at the time of the sinking, its main effect was the elimination of the Argentine Navy as a threat. And so, after its loss, the entire Argentine fleet, with the exception of the submarine ARA San Luis, returned to port and did not leave again during the fighting. And so now, with the Air Force and the Navy mostly dealt with, there was really only the Army left to fight. The 2 escorting destroyers and the battle group centered on the aircraft ARA 25 de Mayo both withdrew from the area, ending the direct threat to the British fleet that their pincer movement had represented. Now, in another incident later that night, British forces engaged an Argentine patrol gunboat, the ARA Alferez Sobral, that was searching for the crew of the Argentine Air Force Canberra light bomber that was shot down on the 1st of May. 2 Royal Navy Lynx helicopters fired 4 Sea Skua missiles at it, and badly damaged and with 8 crew dead, Alferez Sobral managed to return to Puerto Deseado 2 days later. Now, the 4th of May, 2 days after the sinking of General Belgrano, the British lost the Type 42 destroyer HMS Sheffield to fire following an Exocet missile strike from the Argentine 2nd Naval Air Fighter/Attack Squadron. Sheffield had been ordered forward with 2 other Type 42s to provide a long-range radar and medium-high-altitude missile far from the British carriers. However, it was struck with devastating effect, killing 20 crew members and severely injuring 24 others. The ship was abandoned several hours later, gutted and deformed by the fires that continued to burn for 6 more days. It finally sank outside the maritime exclusion zone on the 10th of May. Now, at sea, the limitations of the British ship's anti-aircraft defenses were shown in the sinking of HMS Ardent on the 21st of May, HMS Antelope, and the loss of cargo of helicopters, runway building equipment, and tents on NV Atlantic Conveyor on the 25th of May. The loss of all but one of the Chinook helicopters being carried by the Atlantic Conveyor, as well as their maintenance equipment and facilities, was a severe blow from a logistical perspective. Now, also lost on the 25th of May was HMS Coventry, a sister Sheffield, while in company with HMS Broadsword after being ordered to act as a decoy to draw away Argentine aircraft from other ships at San Carlos Bay. HMS Argonaut and HMS Brilliant were moderately damaged. However, many British ships escaped being sunk because of limitations imposed by circumstances on Argentine pilots. To avoid the highest concentration of British air defenses, Argentine pilots released bombs at very low altitude, and hence a lot of these bombs didn't have time to explode. The low release of the return bombs meant that most of them never exploded. The pilots would have been aware of this, but due to the high concentration required to avoid SAMs, anti-aircraft artillery, and British Sea Harriers, many failed to climb to the necessary release point. Argentine forces solved the problem by fitting improvised retarding devices, allowing the pilots to effectively use low-level bombing attacks on the 8th of June. Now, on the 30th of May, two super étendards, one carrying Argentina's last remaining exocet, was escorted by four A4C Skyhawks, each with two 500-pound bombs, took off to attack Invincible. Argentine intelligence had sought to determine the position of the carriers by analyzing aircraft flight routes from the task force to the islands. However, the British had an order that all aircraft conducting a low-level transit should do that when leaving or returning to the carriers to disguise where they actually were. And this confused the Argentines, who focused on a group of escorts 40 miles south of the actual target. Two of the attacking Skyhawks were shot down by Sea Dart missiles fired by HMS Exeter. No damage was caused to any British vessels. Alright, and that is all. The next video we'll be talking about the actual land attacks, and so if you're interested in that, stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you next time.